Thank you very much for your three very different but terrific presentations. My question has to do with open space and the degree to which you think that open spaces at grade improves the quality of life for those people that live in Toronto, Saudi Arabia, or Mumbai.
I'm not quite sure in terms of the exact ratios between the built space versus the open spaces that makes us either comfortable or uncomfortable. However, I do feel that the common spaces at the ground level are as essential as they are probably, in particular in case of tall buildings, as my colleague here said, that creating a social spaces in tall building, like Shanghai Tower has apparently some of the largest social spaces in the tall structure. Or we created a project in Copenhagen where we were creating towers to grow food, by the way, physically. And so I think the bottom line is the open space is critical to human health. I think it's critical in terms of the air, daylight, and on and on and on. So I think, am I answering your question? Okay, great, thank you. Anything else?
I work on a project that we put larger open spaces, high-income neighborhoods, and it's the fastest land value appreciation in Metro Manila. And then on lower income neighborhoods, the open space is like the outdoor living room, where there's more social intercourse and interaction among neighbors.
If I could just add, I mean, open spaces obviously, I think obviously is incredibly important, but there needs to be an understanding of the scale of that open space and its relationship to the buildings around it. For example, I was in Brasilia, I don't know if any of you have been there, which is the big sort of Niemeyer and Costa master plan from the 50s, and it has a sort of an absurdly large park going down right down the center of the city. And while on paper, perhaps it might seem like a good idea to have such a space, the end result isn't positive for the city. And I find similarly when we work through projects, there's often requests or demands for open space without a good sense of what that space will accomplish, how it will be maintained, and who's going to really occupy it.
I had a question, I guess it could be for anyone on the panel, but somewhat also in relation to a question I asked earlier in the open session in the morning in Anthony's presentation about potential local culture being incorporated into design work. And what I noticed, for example, in Richard, your presentation, this is not a critique in any way, but some of the solutions, I mean, that we're employing are very common around, globally, and I don't see that as necessarily a problem because humans were pretty similar at the end of the day, and a lot of the stuff, and also in the second presentation today, we saw that certainly there are, depending on where we're working, there are definitely climatic conditions, and of course there are cultural things, particularly in the Middle East, that we have to accommodate and consider, and I have tremendous respect for all of that, but. I guess my question is, how do you, on the panel, and this again open to anyone, how do you see that sort of role of the globalization of design? And in addition, that you showed this in the second presentation, this project where you're having these big name firms come in from all over the world to work on a project, and we're seeing that all over the place in China and so on. So just kind of. How do you see the role of local culture in a situation where the solutions may be really, the best solutions may actually be globally imported solutions?
If I could just answer that in terms of what I was suggesting, what I showed was a very Toronto-specific response to a set of criteria which I think are important for creating a certain quality of residential housing, and that could be anywhere. So if you think of a concept of something like natural surveillance, In Toronto, that might take on a sort of vernacular form of porches or front doors that face it, whereas in a different country with different climate, that might take on a very different sort of articulation. But the point is that I find those criteria aren't being implemented in any way in most of the world. So I think you're absolutely right. There's definitely a cultural response which could take a number of different forms, but as long as the principles of what I've suggested are being addressed, everyone should believe that we can create a good quality of residential high-density neighborhoods anywhere.
I have actually designed projects practically all over the world, from Russia to India and United States to China. In my view, by the way, and I can give you some examples as to how we try to analyze it. The first critical part is in terms of understanding of culture. I believe Vinda, my colleague here, mentioned about asking questions. If you go into a neighborhood where you're designing buildings for middle income or low income cases, I think we owe it to ourselves to ask those questions as to what their aspirations are as well, which are embedded in their cultural beliefs as well. It's very critical. As an example of that, I did a low-income housing outside of Delhi. It was designed on the basis of flat slabs and sheer walls, smaller apartments, but creating public spaces throughout the building, at ground level as well as throughout the building. Unfortunately, the project didn't get built. In case of residential particularly, by the way, the issue of privacy is extremely critical to understand in different parts of the world. How we view in New York is so different than how they view in Riyadh, by the way, and in China. Give you a small example of it. In residential buildings that we designed in Saudi Arabia, you have to make sure that the apartment layouts are such that the women and family, when they enter, they create their own privacy, and you don't enter through the public spaces of the living room and so on and so forth. India, it is not the case. But in case of a public bathrooms, for example, in Riyadh versus New York, or Western world for that matter, a simple things like a public toilet in New York, which is common to do a partition, which is 2 inches thick metal with some insulation in it, but it's raised from the floor for ease of cleanliness, is not acceptable in Saudi Arabia. Because their sense of privacy of using bathroom all the way up to the sounds. Even the sound is an issue of privacy for people in the Middle East. So if you don't understand that, and if you don't get that, it's a problem. Climatic conditions, on the other hand, by the way, are much easier to deal with because it's data-driven. And these days, all you have to do is push a few buttons and you get the data for any part, anywhere in the world in no time. And then it's a question of analyzing it and applying it in a very rational manner to design the most efficient facades. But the aesthetic considerations of the culture, on the other hand, are a tricky subject. And the only couple of examples I can give you is that when I'm doing a project in China, which is not too far from here, the client defined that cultural aspiration in terms of formal sense, facade sense, and material senses. But when it came to the issue of designing a museum in Riyadh or a mosque in Riyadh, you saw how we have interpreted their cultural aspects. Even minaret is not associated with the mosque. It's basically taken away, but in that very conservative society, by the way, they embrace the idea of interpreting that interpretation of our aspect of culture. I hope I'm answering that. By the way, it's the most complicated issue that the question you have asked. Interpretation of culture is the most difficult thing. I find it very challenging very difficult. And understanding people's aspiration, equally, I find it very challenging to understand. I mean, we all seem to speak same language, and yet we are completely at times on a different planet. And that's the issue we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, you know.
The sort of statistics that you showed and the idea of the slum rehabilitation, I'm going to kind of tie together both of those questions. I've worked on a slum rehabilitation project, not the slum rehabilitation part, but one that's going when it's being rehabilitated. And I found it absolutely frightening. The rehousing, which actually has lost all of the concept of public space and open space, you know, the kind of thing that James has just been talking about. And I think a kind of a cultural sensitivity. So I'm going to disagree with not really what you said, but I think there's a huge amount of architectural imagination required to take the information you provided and address that in a way which I think can be meaningful towards slum rehabilitation.
I agree with that, but you have to first ask these questions and use this data and then use your imagination, but you can't just start off with no data. That's what I'm saying.